helixcenter.org or thehelixcenter.org, where you can view the roundtable in its entirety. And we encourage you to let us know what you think. Helix Center Facebook page, or write us at thehelixcenter@gmail.com. So we're following up on our inquiry into beginnings by posing complementary questions about endings. Why are we curious about endings, whether it's that of the cosmos, our own? Can we discover something about each other's curiosity about endings? How might conceptualizations of the end of consciousness, life, civilization, and the universe at large inform one another? So I'd like to introduce our guests today, starting here. James Berger is Senior Lecturer in American Studies and English at Yale University. He received his BA from Columbia University, his MA from Teachers College, Columbia University, and his PhD from the University of Virginia. His interests include 20th and 21st century American literature, literary theory, disability studies, neuroscience and literature, and apocalyptic literature and film, the latter including apocalypticism and the notion of the post-apocalyptic, and exploring the limits of language, the relations between language and non-language, the status of discursive objects imagined as somehow, whether through global catastrophe, personal impairment, or religious or ethical imperative, outside the bounds of discourse. Dr. Berger is the author of multiple scholarly articles, and his books include After the End, Representations of Post-Apocalypse. Next to him is Paul J. Steinhardt, the Albert Einstein Professor in Science and Director of the Princeton Center for Theoretical Science at Princeton University, where he is also on the faculty of both the Department of Physics and the Department of Astrophysical Sciences. He received his BA in Physics from Caltech and his MA and PhD both in Physics from Harvard University. The author of over 200 refereed articles, 5 patents, 3 technical books, numerous popular articles, and the co-author of the 2007 Endless Universe, The Big Bang and Beyond, a popular book on contemporary theories of cosmology. Professor Steinhardt's research spans problems in particle physics, astrophysics, cosmology, and condensed matter physics. With Neil Turok at Cambridge University, he proposed the cyclic model, a radical alternative to Big Bang inflationary cosmology, in which the evolution of the universe is periodic, and the key events shaping the large-scale structure of the universe occur before the Big Bang. Next is William Koblener, Associate Professor of English at Bar Ilan University. He received his BA from Columbia College, his MA from University College Oxford, and his PhD from Columbia University. He has written in major scholarly journals in literature, history, theology, psychoanalysis, and cultural criticism on Jewish topics in Commentary, Azur, JQR, and AJS Review, Tradition, and many other Jewish publications, and the Washington Post column, Letter from Israel. Professor Koblener is also the author of the 2008 book, Milton's Warring Angels, a study of critical engagements, and the 2011 Open-Minded Torah of Irony, Fundamentalism, and Love. Michael Rampino is Professor of Biology with the Earth and Environmental Sciences program at New York University, and is a research consultant at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He received his BA from Hunter College of the City University of New York and his PhD in Geological Sciences from Columbia University. A highly regarded teacher at NYU, Professor Rampino's research led to his proposal of the Shiva hypothesis, a general theory integrating astrophysics, planetary geology, and the environment, and the history of life to account for Earth's periodic extinctions. His research also investigates the role of volcanic eruptions and extinctions, biogeochemical cycles, and global climate over a range of timescales. So our roundtable will go for about an hour and a half, followed by time for questions and discussion from the audience. So let's begin the end. Why are we curious about endings?
Who wants to start?
Well, Rob, you want to say something about the lack of microphone for Bill?
Oh, yes. Dr. Koblener, in observing the Sabbath, cannot wear an amplifying microphone today, so he will speak.
I'll talk loud.
He'll talk loudly.
Okay.
That was good.
Okay.
Well, I'll start, I guess. My background is in geological sciences, and there's been a paradigm shift in the geological sciences over the past couple of decades, and that's away from the old idea of change happening gradually over time, very slowly over very long periods of geological time, to a new vision, which is much more apocalyptic, which suggests that there are individual catastrophes which are happening periodically to the Earth, and those catastrophes are causing mass extinctions of life. And as far as the history of life is concerned, when you talk about endings, more than 99% of the species that have ever existed on the Earth are extinct. So in terms of species, extinction is the name of the game. They last for a few million years, then either they evolve to something else, or else they become extinct with no issue.
I'll follow up. I'm interested that this is about endings, and a couple of weeks ago was beginnings. As a literary critic, I think of Eliot's term or phrase, the end is where we start from. And the beginnings and ends are always related one to another. And I'm just very interested on being on a panel, first of all, with another literary critic, but I'm interested in the way you think about catastrophe and paradigm shift, and to think about ways in which the languages of the sciences also use plotting as a device. I saw an advertisement on television for a new movie called something Extinction. Extinction is thematized in our culture, and it's used, I think, in a narrative sense. And I'm wondering for both of you, kind of from a scientific point of view, how much narrative or storytelling or plotting is something that gets, I don't know, it's obviously not foregrounded to the same extent that it would be for me and Jim, but I'm wondering how much that is a live issue for you. That's my curiosity.
Well, the old idea of the gradualistic change in the earth sciences comes out of Lyell, Charles Lyell, his book Principles of Geology back in 1831. And Lyell saw geological happenings as being gradual and being connected. And so there was a story there, the gradual history of the earth. And he didn't believe in evolution at the time, so life was somehow put into this picture. And it was for many years in geology, when you were a student taking Geology 101, you were taught this saying, the present is the key to the past. In other words, things that are happening in the present time, geological processes, if you extrapolate those over long time periods, even very gradual, slow changes like erosion by rivers add up into a big result like the Grand Canyon. And that was part of Lyell's view of the naturalness, the gradualness of nature. That this was the way God set things up, and there was an order to this, the order that was in God's mind when he created the universe.
Yeah, I was going to say something akin to what you marked, which is that one of the reasons why we're interested in the end of the universe, or since I'm a cosmologist, we're talking about the universe, is because it gives us a lot of information about how it began and the stages of evolution in between. They're all tied together. And so the debates that we're having about what's going to happen next in the universe are all tightly related to what set up the conditions that led to the conditions we observe today. And those are in turn tied very closely to how the evolution of the universe is tied to the fundamental laws of physics and what those laws tell us about conditions at the very beginning, or at the Big Bang, or maybe even before the Big Bang.
Yeah, I suppose, right. I mean, one difference you can point to between the way that the English teachers and the scientists do it. I mean, I think we, in our thinking about narrative, place the human subject kind of at the center of it, and we know that, for one thing, we ourselves are finite. So the question of ending has to do, I think, with the question of finitude in general. And narrative contributes to that. There's a great line in Don DeLillo, one of Don DeLillo's novels, all plots lead toward death. So there's that perspective. You know, as you're thinking of plots, there's going to be an ending to the plot. At the same time, you have the example of Scheherazade, in which plot extends life. And as long as you can tell the story, you can extend, you can put off finitude. There's a couple of movies. I don't know. It's hard for me to think abstractly about this. You know, I think in terms of movies. There's a 1991 Wim Wenders movie called Until the End of the World, in which, after a lot of kind of weird misadventures, they end up in Australia at the end of the world. And just at that moment, a nuclear satellite falls down, creates this electromagnetic disruption all around the world, or at least in Australia. And so, and they think, they're so isolated, they think the world has in fact ended. at which point the plot of the movie completely shifts, and there's this amazing invention which someone has developed in order to capture the neurochemical event of vision for one of the character's blind mothers. His mother is blind. So she is able to see images again. But they also has this other purpose, which is they discover they can see their own dreams. They can basically videotape their own dreams. And so they get this insight into this experience of what you might call in psychoanalytic terms primary process, complete unmediation, the complete absence, the eradication of mediations, this extraordinarily sophisticated medium for eliminating mediation. And what happens is they become addicted to their dreams. That's all they want to do. And so that becomes, in a sense, the apocalypse. That's the revelation, is this revelation of complete interiority and complete removal from any symbolic world, any social symbolic world. And I think to some degree that's also what apocalyptic thinking is a yearning for. I mean, here we are, these symbolic, we're so involved in our symbolic communications, our relationships to ourselves seem to be mediated. What is there that's direct? What is there that's unmediated? How do you get to sort of the thing itself? And some level, what apocalyptic thinking allows you to do is to find some place in fiction, in imagination, where that takes place. So I think a lot of apocalyptic narratives have to do with the bashing of this symbolic edifice so that you have people who somehow are absolutely there without symbolic overlays. But that's, I don't know, that's in fiction.
Yeah, I'm interested, when I'm in the presence of a cosmologist, I think I'm a little antiquated. I think of Augustine and John Milton as cosmologists. And for them, I'm just a little bit working on what you're suggesting, Jim, about apocalypse and the kind of pre-modern manifestations of apocalyptic thinking, which is just the way everyone thought. That is, thinking that history has a telos. There's an eschaton towards which history is tending. And the way in which that sense of an ending infuses the present, meaning there's not only a beginning and an end, but that sense of an ending takes chronometric time. Literary critic Frank Kermode uses this distinction between chronos, kind of waiting time, where I think in Shakespearean terms, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. That lack of mediation. Things happen. But an end, and Kermode uses the Greek term kairos, I guess it means the fullness of time. That end towards which one is tending not only informs the end of history, but also infuses the present. And you spoke before about the present being the key to the past, and I think in some sense, models of time, I think maybe Adam Phillips might put it like this: tell me what you think about time and I'll tell you what you believe. Because conceptions of time, is there an end towards which we're tending, or is there not really as the basis of a sort of kind of theological or religious belief? And I'm wondering, in a kind of scientific or postmodern or post-apocalyptic world, how does the eschaton, or in Aristotelian terms, does the notion of life as a plot, as either cosmological time as a plot of a beginning, middle, and end, and the way that might interact with the subject, thinking of his own life or her own life as a plot with beginning, middle, and end, is that still something that's viable? Or in a post-apocalyptic age, or in an age given over to scientific stories and narratives, are those really antiquated? That sense of an ending.
Yeah, I think that's I'm going to give to the science, but just to add one thing to that. I think in the sense of endings that you're talking about, and the Kermode and many other people are talking about, the end, the way one conceives the end is what gives meaning to the present. But I think in the scientific way of thinking, in the cosmological way of thinking, I can't imagine how that would be actually take place, whether sort of the meaning of social and personal life would have anything to do with the way one conceives of the ending of the universe as hypothesized scientifically.
Yeah, I think we're talking about humanity, end of humanity, for example, which is one kind of apocalypse we think about. The Earth, another kind of apocalypse, and then the universe, which is a different kind of end we could talk about. I think one thing that's happened in cosmology in just the last few decades has been a tremendous opening up of the possibilities of even what we mean by universe, which colors the question of what do you mean by the end? The end of what? What are you interested in? So, of course, we're interested in humans and the Earth, but in terms of the universe, are we interested in the part of the universe we observe? Because up until recently, we had the notion that we observe all that there is. But the current view is that what we observe is a tiny infinitesimal patch of what is out there, and that what we observe may or may not be typical of what is out there. Now, we may be interested in this patch because it is all we see and can ever hope to see. I mean, the laws of physics prohibit us from seeing regions that are beyond a certain, that are stretching far enough, fast enough from us. And for that region, we can talk about an end. We can imagine two kinds of ends, at least two kinds of ends. One in which it crunches into something like a black hole, in which time and space lose their meaning. And another one which is where time in some sense lasts forever, but not in a meaningful sense. The universe expands into more and more vacuum and becomes more and more vacuous and empty and continues that way forever, this patch of space we observe. In either of those circumstances, there may be interesting events, creation events, in fact, occurring in other parts of the universe, where new regions are being created, new patches are being created, and for all, and in many plausible circumstances, this process would continue eternally, forever, and there would be no end to the entire process, although there may be ends to the regions which are of greatest interest to us. So, I've just given you a few examples of some of the wider variety of possibilities that have been opened up and motivated by recent ideas in cosmology, just to give you a taste.
I know a few years ago, it was a lot simpler story. The universe began in the Big Bang, and through cause and effect, scientists could trace the history of the universe from the time of the Big Bang to the present. And the idea then was that either the universe was going to expand forever, or if the galaxies were massive enough, the gravity would pull it all back in again. But things have changed since then. Things have become much more complex.
So first of all, in terms of the future, going to the future, we've discovered there's an entity in the universe which we knew in principle could be there, but which we didn't realize was actually there, which is what we call dark energy. So most forms of matter all the forms of matter that we're familiar with gravitationally attract each other. In fact, most of us learned in school that gravity always attracts. It's not actually true. Gravity attracts for certain forms of matter and energy, but not for others. There are forms of matter and energy in which it actually causes a repulsion. We've known about it since 1917, but you probably didn't hear about it in school because no one believed it actually was an important component of the real universe. Well, we now know from recent measurements in the last decade that 73% of the universe is this stuff. And so it's already taken over the universe in terms of being the dominant form of energy in the universe. And it's causing, therefore, the expansion of the universe to accelerate at the present time, speed up rather than slow down. So it's actually promoting the expansion rather than resisting it. And if this continues, then what will happen over time is more and more of the matter that we see in the universe today, the galaxies and stars, will begin to disappear from view because of this expansion. Every region of the universe will begin to approach empty space. And this will be a kind of end which is like T.S. Eliot's whimper, in which you simply slowly decay into an emptier and more deadly universe for this patch of the universe. And that's a possible end to the universe. Mm-hmm. An alternative point of view is that this dark energy is unstable and will eventually decay, and then it will lead to a new crunch, bang, and the process will begin again, even in this patch of the universe.
So you have
all these things
periodic,
and it could even repeat periodically. So this is the idea behind a possible return of the idea of a kind of cyclical universe. So
you're saying there are other patches. We're just living in a patch.
Well, what is almost certain is that what we observe is a tiny patch of a much larger space. That when we look at the farthest distances we can see, those are not the edge of space. They're simply the edge of what we can see, because the oldest light we can observe is 13.7 billion years old. It's only had a chance to travel 13.7 billion light years. That's as far as we can see.
Okay.
But that doesn't say that there isn't plenty of space out there.
So that boundary is not a boundary.
It's not a boundary at all. It's in fact, we call it our horizon, because it's essentially a limit to our vision of what we can see,
So
given
how
our
do you
vantage
know
point
there
in the
is
universe.
something beyond them?
Well, we can already see hints of it when we look at radiation that comes from the oldest radiation we observe in the universe gives us is radiation that comes from a time when the universe cooled to the point that the first atoms were forming in the universe. So let's go back a bit. If we extrapolate back in the time, the universe was more and more contracted and more heated up. As you contract a gas, it heats up. If you go back far enough in time, it was hot enough to boil atoms into their fundamental constituents. So now, around that time, which was about 13.4 billion years ago, 13.7 billion years ago, the first atoms formed, the universe became transparent, radiation began to stream freely through the universe, and we collect today and get a picture of what the distribution of matter and radiation looks like at that time. And what it shows us is an extremely uniform distribution of matter and radiation that even gives us some vision of how smooth, if you hadn't, even is able to show us that there isn't an edge, that this isn't the edge, that there has to be something beyond the light to give us a kind of smooth boundary to what we're seeing. So that already extends us a short distance, and most of our theories to explain that degree of homogeneity tell us that actually what we observe is a much tinier patch of a much smoother region of space. It must be much larger than what we observe. And in many versions of many of these theories, that this is one of many, infinitely many patches that would have formed over time and would continue to form over time. So very pushing us way beyond what we can actually observe.
So, Doctor, how much time do we have?
This is when we need Alvy Singer's pediatrician's reassurance that Brooklyn's not expanding, right?
Yeah, I think Brooklyn's okay.
How much time we have, or? I don't know.
Earth is a habitable place, I guess.
Well, the universe is a habitable place. Let me say that could be quite long. You know, I mean, as long as our sun exists. You know, so another 5 billion years or so. And our galaxy in this scenario would be habitable until such point that there might have been a crunch or something like that. If that were to occur, then estimates would range from anywhere from tens of billions of years to indefinite.
I mean, I just, I can't help but latch onto the Woody Allen line. I mean, I just wonder, what are the effects of these kinds of cosmological perspectives, speculations, horizons? What is that? What is the effect of that on subjects? I mean, we have models of time with beginnings and middles and ends. And Jim and I were talking before in the green room, as it were, about the persistence of the modernist emphasis on endings. And I'm really interested with Jim. We didn't pursue it because there is a certain kind of postmodern claim that we're post-ending, we're post-apocalyptic, and it seems, especially what Paul has articulated, that cosmological visions of the universe reinforce those models. But is there a persistence of a sense of an ending that renders the present meaningful? I mean, the postmodern abandonment of that kind of ending leaves a kind of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And I'm just wondering, is there, in the world that we live, have we given up those endings? Psychically, as subjects? Do we structure our lives as plots? the psychoanalysts ask their patients to think of their lives in narrative terms. And I think in some places, and here I'm speaking out of my discipline, that Freud speaks of past, present, and future in terms of id, ego, and superego, and the sense in which a non-repressive version of the superego, that the vision of the future, the idealized vision of the future, will help me reconstitute my desires, my drives, allow them to speak in a certain way, my past, so I can live in a more meaningful present. And again, I'm wondering about the seeming facticity of a universe that is one among many in a billion-year scheme, and our own thrust or drive for meaning. And I think meaning comes, that's why I asked you at the beginning about plots and stories. Meaning comes through stories and plots. And the story that you gave us is first of all multifaceted. In the 17th century, there was, you should know this, there was speculation about many, many worlds, the first kind of science fiction. And it was very unsettling for those who lived in a kind of Platonic universe where there was the divine plot, the divine sentence with beginning, middle, and end. And wonder, post-science, post this kind of cosmology, where does the subject, how does the subject mean? How does the subject plot?
Well, we exist on one planet out of probably many, many habitable planets in the galaxy, and we're the product of 4 billion years of evolution. And so if you look at it from the cosmic context, at least here on this habitable planet, evolution, the origin of life started here. Evolution produced more and more complex kinds of life, and we are the most intelligent, at least for the time being, form of life on the planet. And so we have that narrative. This is a course that I teach at NYU. You have the narrative of looking back from this special place, which is human consciousness, and looking back at the history of the universe. It all seems like it's leading someplace, but then that's just a way of looking at it. It really doesn't mean anything because evolution is very, very contingent.
In cosmology, I'd even make that point more strongly. The discovery of dark energy, I think, shatters this kind of vision that many people had of just what you described, the universe itself as evolving from simple to more and more complex. If there were not this dark energy, if we only had ordinary matter and radiation, the idea that we had be up until a decade or so, then the prediction would have been that the universe does become more and more complex, more and more structure forms, more and more galaxies form, more and more planets form. But that story is now shattered. Something recently on a cosmic scale has happened. Dark energy has taken over the universe. Now the expansion of the universe is accelerating. That prevents the formation of any further structure in the universe. The largest structures we see in the universe today are will be the last to form. And now what the universe will be doing is reverting to, we'll be turning into an emptier and emptier universe. And this has happened, so this is shattering from several points of view. It means there's something special at this particular juncture in time in cosmology. We live at a juncture in time in cosmology. On the one hand, there's enough matter in the universe that we can see galaxies and stars and planets out there. So we can see that where the past came from. We can also see that there's dark energy in the universe, so we can see where we're headed. If we had lived, let's say, 6 billion years ago, we could see the matter, but we couldn't see the dark energy. If we, in the future, will be able to see the dark energy, it'll be hard to see the matter. So we live at a very special point in time. This shatters the notion of evolution as some sort of steady process in which every moment is, in some sense, as good as any other moment. There's really something special about this juncture in cosmology, and we don't understand why. It's just a fact of nature. We have to live with what nature hands us, whether we like the answer or not.
Is it special because we're here? Is the anthropic principle kind of working here? We're there because we're there. If we were early, we wouldn't be here. If we were late, we wouldn't be here.
No, we could have. So there could well be species that evolved earlier. We've evolved, relatively. Evolution could have occurred faster. Suppose it 4 billion years ago, sentient beings evolved in the universe. They would have a lot of trouble seeing that the fact that there was this dark energy. because the ratio of dark energy to matter changes over time. So back then, the dark energy would have been a relatively small percentage. Now it's kind of intermediate. We see there's a significant fraction of matter and a significant fraction of dark energy. In the future, it becomes more and more dark energy. But it could have been, well, it could be that life evolves in our galaxy, let's say 100 billion years from now. They will have a lot of trouble seeing that there was a lot of matter once in the universe. They'll think they just lived in one little island galaxy. They won't see the billions of galaxies we see. And they'll see almost everything being dark energy, and they'll have a lot of trouble reconstructing how they got to where they were.
Right.
It'll be very confusing.
The cosmologists would be in trouble.
Cosmologists evolve at that time, for the first time at that time, will be a lot of trouble. They will have a lot of trouble reconstructing their history. Just like cosmologists that were born 4 billion years ago would have a lot of trouble figuring out that the future was going to be one dominated by dark energy. So this is shattering to our traditional ideas, and I don't think, to me it's something that's it's a profound importance scientifically what it means, but in terms of what it means in terms of our human reaction to it, I don't think we've even begun to absorb it yet. I don't think the message has gotten out that our view of the world, of the universe, has changed in such a profound way. And it's okay, what are we going to make of it? And
yeah, I can't think of human cultural imaginative examples that in any way take in these scientific findings. The closest I can come is Blake. Saying William Blake, sensing that what we see as the surface of reality is somehow just not really the case, and that you have to burst these doors of perception, and that our whole very terminologies are skewed, that we need a new set of names to talk about what human existence, physical and spiritual, are. The other person, I think, who has some maybe sense of trying to negotiate this.
Speak a little louder, I think, in the back.
Sorry. Okay. The other person is, I'm blocking her name, the South African woman writer. No, the other one. Doris Lessing, yeah, exactly, has this whole series of kind of science fiction, kind of Gnostic science fiction texts in which all kinds of interesting things happen with time. Philip Dick, I guess, would be another example of someone who's making that attempt. But generally, most of us are thinking in terms of the time frames of human history and the various historical, political, social, economic problems which face us at the moment. So in a sense, I think each generation and each writer within each generation, and not just writers, but just people, sort of choose the ending that fits their immediate concerns. So that, say, in the late 19th century, when H.G. Wells was writing, you can see in a book like the Time Machine, exactly what the kind of prevalent social anxieties there are, which are anxieties about evolution and which way evolution is going, and anxieties about class. So you have sort of Darwin and Marx there, at the center of those apocalyptic anxieties. So that the vision of the end of the world are extrapolations of ideas of Marx and ideas of Darwin. Plus, of course, then there's the bifurcation of the social of the species according to social class. But at the end of that book, if you remember, then actually he even brings in the cosmological view. You have the sense that everything is gone except these completely non-human creatures, and the sun is this giant thing that's expanding and about to, encompass the Earth or something. And in a relatively trivial, or at least weird, contemporary example, I've actually been watching this TV show, The Doomsday Preppers. What is the Doomsday Preppers about? It's basically a home improvement show. How do you build the perfect bunker, Ted and Edie, believe that the world's magnetic poles are going to shift in the next 5 years, and therefore they need an underground bunker. They need to stock, how are they best going to do it? And they consult experts, and they, build whatever the heck they build. But what are they really worried about? They're worried about the social chaos that will ensue. That's a lot of people. They're worried about the social chaos that will ensue from some catastrophic breakdown of whatever it may be. And these people are always not in cities. There is never a doomsday prepper in New York City. Because if you are one, you're not going to be here. You're going to move somewhere else.
But don't you think some of this, and you were bringing in psychoanalysis, some of this has just to do with reactions to mortality and various ways of trying to deny mortality?
The preppers, maybe. The preppers are basically worried about black people pouring out of cities and invading the suburbs. I mean, the racial subtext of this show is unbelievable. I mean, so yes. I mean, I would say.
You can direct your anxiety in different ways. You can express it through different things. But if they end with you ending, then it has to have something to do with mortality. You mentioned psychoanalysis and meaning. There are different ways psychoanalysis looks at meaning. One way you look at meaning is when you have a person in analysis, you try to understand what is the meaning of their behavior, what is the meaning of their interaction with others, what is their meaning and the meaning of their fantasies about themselves and others. But then when you're talking about meaning of life, that's something that develops over time. I don't think an 18-year-old really cares much about the meaning of life. He cares about getting a nice car and a nice girlfriend and so on. The older you get, the more the issue of meaning of life and achievements and what you've done and what your kids are doing becomes more central. So, and that again has to do with mortality, is the idea that things are not going to last forever, so you may as well feel like you had some kind of good or impact or something that you did in this world. And this came up last time, and it keeps coming up to my mind, and I've asked a number of cosmologists and physicists, and I don't really get an answer. And the question I have, which I think Rob put under the rubric, or Mark Norell put under the rubric of curiosity, is why are we interested in the stuff you're talking about? I mean, that, you know, you're talking about billions of years. I maybe have 10 more years of life. Why do I care what's going to happen, what happened billions of years before I was even around? And why do I care about what's going to happen 15 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? Maybe for my kids, but after that, there is no. But yet we have this tremendous, I personally have, curiosity and interest in the kind of work that you do. And there has to be something in humans that makes us want to keep understanding this, even to a degree that which seems almost not understandable, that this black energy expands or doesn't expand or whatever else it does.
Well, first of all, hopefully it does become understandable. When you first discover things, at first they're confusing, but they begin to become familiar as you deal with them more and more. Well, why are we interested? Well, I think we're all curious to know where we came from, where we're going, and why things are the way they are. And so the question of the future is not just a question about the future. It's a question about what forms of energy can exist in the universe, what kinds of effects, what are the interactions between matter, energy, and gravity, because not only does that affect the future, but it affects every stage of the universe, including the present and what's even happening in this room. So if I want to know, for example, why the atoms in our bodies are stable, I ultimately have to understand something about the most microscopic components of matter, which are the key components of matter that existed at the very beginning of the universe. If there was a beginning, at the very beginning of the universe, when the universe was quite young, the universe was boiled into those constituents, and how they interacted is what eventually determined how you ended up with atoms and molecules, planets and Earths and humans, and that's also related to what's going to happen in the future. And you want to study every stage of this. I mean, the goal is to figure out this puzzle of why things are the way they are, and you use every hint available to you, which includes thinking about the past, future, present, recent past, and immediate future.
But there's another way to look at it, which is that if there was no end, there wouldn't be really an interest in end. So must be that to some degree our own mortality is what's encouraging us or what's pushing us. So when you say, well, everybody's interested in where it began, where it is, and where it's going, yes, that is true. But why is it so? Why be interested? So psychoanalysts have theories about why it's that we become interested in our beginnings and in our endings. But the fact that we all are aware that there is a final danger, which is mortality, and that we are biologically designed to always avoid danger. We are constantly avoiding danger, and we have the signal of anxiety which tells us there's danger, don't go there, don't go there, don't go there. So that anxiety must have something to do with the kind of things we need to find out, because we feel as if in our fantasies that the more we know, the safer we are.
Who was teaching cosmology at Princeton 4 billion years ago?
Don't remember, yeah.
I just wondered, when I was speaking about meaning before, I really meant on a psychic level, the way in which conceptions of my ideal self will allow me to give meaning to my past, and therefore my present. And I think the question that you're implicitly asking or raising is really the theological question. And we know that Freud's sense of religion was one of a kind of false consolation. And Adam Phillips writes about the kind of magical narratives, charming oneself with visions of the future. And through those charming narratives, those fantasies of a benevolent future, a future that gives meaning, of rendering the present meaningful. Phillips says it's really avoiding our helplessness. Our fundamental humanity is defined by their helplessness, and we use these narratives of the future, of a comforting future, a significant end, to avoid that. And I'm wondering, and we've spoken about apocalypse and we've spoken about endings. There's also messianism, which functions in the same kind of way. And I'm wondering to the extent, I find Phillips so interesting because he's skeptical about everything. And he'll write one book where he undermines one set of terms, and the next book he will write will undermine the terms that he used to undermine the previous terms. The one thing that he shows no skepticism about is a critique of just this kind of theological thinking. Meaning theology, coming from this Freudian matrix, and I know not everybody embraces this in the Freudian matrix, and Lowell and Lear are exceptions to a certain extent, but theology becomes the one thing about which one, and the endings that it posits, becomes the one thing about which there is endless and only skepticism. And even your comments, Ed, I think indicate that. We get old, and we get worried, and we sense danger, and we get sentimental, and we create narratives about the future. I'm wondering if that's an exhaustive account. And obviously, this kind of transcends the disciplinary conversation. Where does theology fit in? Or does it not? Is there a generous view of theology from a psychoanalytic point of view, from a scientific point of view? Is it something we just tolerate or presume might exist in one of those patches someplace else? Is it an embarrassing question to even be asking?
I think it's implied in any idea of meaning. Theo, if implying actual God as being part of the picture. It's a world. There are worldviews.
For some reason, your
Really?
voice is not
Can
going.
this be adjusted? Is there? I don't know. Okay. All right. I don't want to sort of talk with my. Enough of it. Yeah, it is hard to talk about. I mean, there's plenty of people who have an apocalyptic messianic view of the world. The Left Behind series has sold an enormous number of books, the Christian apocalyptic perspective. But I assume when you're talking about theology, you're not that doesn't exhaust the question. I mean, I don't know. Next year in Jerusalem, I don't think I'm going to be there.
Who knows?
Sure. I mean, I'm not. I don't think we should be rebuilding the temple or anything along those lines. It is. It's not an embarrassing question, but it's certainly a difficult question because I think some sort of ultimate sense of where we are and where we're going is implied in all the literary cases that I'm looking at. It may or may not be involved in the minds of scientists who are thinking in these things. I mean, for myself, just in my lazy way, I think that if the universe is going to drift off forever, as you described in one scenario, that is a bad thing. If the universe is going to recoil back on itself and begin again, that to me would be a hopeful possibility. And so that, I suppose, is theological.
From a planetary science point of view, the galaxy is full of planets. And some of those must be Earth-like planets, just by the statistics. And on some of those Earth-like planets, there could be evolution of life would go on, and it would produce intelligent beings. And so to a lot of astronomers and planetary scientists, the galaxy is probably full of civilizations, intelligent civilizations, possibly trying to contact each other over the vast distances of space. So we're just one world in a many, many world situation.
It's also the case that the distances are so vast that communication is a pretty hopeless possibility.
No, Chris Impey said 2 weeks ago, your colleague Chris Impey said 2 weeks ago, and I don't know if you agree with it or not, he said within the next 100 years, we will have people going to some other habitable planet, and when they go there, they will continue to live there. They will change because they'll be on another planet. But he saw that completely within realm of possibility.
Humans would go elsewhere.
Humans will go out there.
But I think he means planets within our solar system, like Mars.
I don't think he meant Mars. I don't think he meant Mars.
But that's a little bit different than contacting the planets that Mike's talking about, which would be probably habitable planets where there already exists intelligent life. Would be probably much farther out.
We could receive if they were sending out.
Right.
But having a conversation.
I think that's what he was talking. He wasn't talking about Mars.
Well, we can't travel very far into the space because the distances are so vast and our rockets only go so fast. So,
Well, he was saying in the next 100 years.
that's a pretty, I still think it's pretty optimistic.
Right, who's going to pay? No, I think that strikes me as absolutely implausible.
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for it? It's prohibitive.
Also, I think it underestimates the dangers of space. I mean, just thinking about going to Mars, if you, already there's dangers of going that distance. But what you're talking about, which is sort of the Star Wars, Star Trek kind of vision, you have to develop a tremendous technology. I don't think it's 100 years. But I wanted to ask a question because I don't know the answer to this. So in a lot of the discussion we're having about theology and cosmology acts like one presumes that the interest in theology is cosmological. And my impression is that's a more modern addition to theology. Theology was really designed about everyday life and decisions we make about our relationship between ourselves and God and how we should behave, and was never, it was never intended as a serious competition with what we would call science nowadays, as creating a cosmological model. That's something we've imposed on it. Maybe in the last 1,000 years or so, or something like that, fairly recently.
Fairly recently, for humanists and a cosmologist mean different things.
Well, I mean, compared to when the religions were created. In other words, the creators of those religions, cosmology was not foremost on their mind. Behavior and ethics was on their mind.
Survival.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of cosmology in narrative terms, and I might have a frame of reference now. I was thinking of Milton, which to me is old. And I said before that, tell me what you believe, and tell me what you think about at the time, and I'll tell you what you believe. Paradise Lost, in a certain sense, is an education in temporality. The first 5 lines of the poem end with, "Till one greater man restore us." It begins with mortality, death, all our woe, the human condition, helplessness, this idea of being lost, and then this ending, "till one greater man restores," that is Jesus, Christ figure who's going to come and redeem history. And I think there are many interesting things about what you said. I think there's in a relationship, and this is why I keep on coming back to it, there's a relationship between cosmology and ethics. There's a relationship between cosmology and how we know the world. There's a relationship between the day-to-day and it's so crucial to Milton and other figures in the Christian world, Dante, even in the classical world, the importance of endings in the Oresteia. Everything tends, in Aeschylus's trilogy, everything tends towards an ending. And in the very beginning of the plot, one can already feel the end of the plot. And I think there is, again, that strong relationship between ending and ethics. I mean, we just tend, I think, naturally to look at these messianic frames as overly simplistic. I mean, Milton gives the lie to that because, in a way, he shows the skeptical or not religious moment in the heart of the religious experience. The reason people keep on reading Milton is because he's a theological skeptic, which is a paradox, because I think he accommodates Ed's sense of, we want to know what the ending is, but he doesn't give into simplistic renderings of what that might be.
Okay, so let me be more specific about my question, because, now I was being vague. So let me say specifically Christianity, I think, imposes constraints on cosmology, because you can't have the idea of original sin and a Messiah unless that sets up a time frame, a rigid time frame of beginning. There's something before, and there's got to be something at the end. If you push that away for a bit, then the idea there might be, and you can see that such a concept really runs into trouble when you think about a universe which has different patches which are being created at different times, and what does it mean to say something? What does this whole story even mean in that context? It sort of loses its meaning in that context entirely, whereas it doesn't lose its meaning in other theological contexts. So I think to some degree the problem, it may be specific with a Christian theology as opposed to other theologies.
I would say Judeo-Christian. I mean, in the 17th century, one sees this tension. Descartes and Hobbes begin to, and Spinoza begin to undermine theology and create a whole different set of disciplinary hierarchies in which science is at the top. Then, of course, there's just a disjunction. And then and theology becomes artifice. And that's why I keep on coming back to plotting. I mean, I'm very interested in the way in which both of you, even as you're presenting us, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be a humanist here, presenting us a picture of the facts are relying upon metaphors, shifts, catastrophe, dark energy, which I think comes from Paradise Lost, dark matter, it's a transformation of Milton's dark matter, maybe, I don't know. So it seems to me that there's always a narrative rendering of the objective scientific world in which you deal with. Obviously, the realm of theology and literature, the artifice is foregrounded. But I understand the discomfort you would have with those older versions of cosmology and how they don't gel with the scientific facts.
And I wonder whether one modern transformation of theological thinking is utopian thinking, which also fell into disrepute and disuse. And the sense, I think, came more that this way of life that we're in, which is capitalism, which is global capital, is simply going to continue and continue. That history, the end of history scenario, that this is what's before us. more and more consumer goods, perhaps increased prosperity around the globe, perhaps not, but at any rate, no alternative. And I think it's that sensibility that has spawned the just absolute plethora of violently ending narratives which characterize the last 50 years. Just so many apocalyptic, the apocalyptic imagination, I think, is very much in response to this sense of the end of historical progression and this sense of sort of what seems to be a lot of stuff happening all the time, everywhere, is really just a kind of a complex form of stasis. And so so theological thinking, yes, it's who needs it? But even utopian thinking is gone. I'm not sure where the origin of this statement is, but it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I think it seems to be the case. There are so many ways to imagine the end of the world, and all of them seem dedicated to just wiping out this crap that seems to be the contemporary world, out of which to which there seems to be no alternative. So the challenge to sort of locate an alternative is and I think that's one of the reasons that, say, the Occupy movement became such a powerful, popular and powerful phenomenon, at least in that moment that it was. Whether it will be again, I don't know. But it certainly was for a while, and because it seemed to be, right, there is some other way of thinking about addressing the social problems that face us in this country and globally. Ways which are not apocalyptic, or which are, but at any rate, some other way of thinking, which is what the utopian imagination is trying to do, and which was, as I say, kind of discredited for some time. But is it a form of theology? I think you can make that argument.
In the evolutionary picture of the history of life and of science, I said that the old idea from Lyell was the present is the key to the past. Study what's going on now, you can figure out what went on in the past. The new motto, this has been replaced, is the past is the key to the future. So study the way what has happened in the past. If it did happen, it can happen, right? And then those things will repeat themselves into the future. And also with Darwinism, Darwin had this very capitalistic mode, right, of competition between species, and extinctions were caused by one species winning the competition. That's all changed now. The picture now is that species go along for a long period of time, pretty much stable, and then something bad happens. And lots of species become extinct, some catastrophe. And in the aftermath of that extinction, life radiates into lots of new forms. The mammals didn't outcompete the dinosaurs. They just managed to survive the catastrophe 65 million years ago, and they radiated into all the forms of mammals that we see today populating the Earth. So there's been a change, and I say, in the whole paradigm.
What do the social Darwinists do with this?
There's no room for social Darwinism.
Yeah.
I think something that's been implicit in much of what's said is kind of the reverse engineering of what you, Paul, were communicating about how the dominance of dark energy would kind of shatter our self-conceptions. The reverse engineering of that being, and you've all been kind of touching upon this, how our self-conceptions shape and influence how you, as scientists, theorize and how you recognize things for what they are. What about the self-conceptions, right, that influence that? That kind of gets at the bridging of the two cultures that you were kind of negotiating down in the green room. I wonder what thoughts you have about that.
I think about that as a theorist as to whether or not we've thought about all the possible kinds of theories one can have of the universe. Historically, most theories of the universe fall into one of three categories. The created universe, which is created and then evolves and just goes forward in time, becoming more and more complex with time. The static universe, the universe that's always the same, and the cyclical type universe. And I think we understand where those come from in terms of our human experience. Cyclicity occurs in certain things in the daily cycle and the seasonal cycle. We understand that. And a stasis we understand. We look out at the stars and they seem to be static, so they have an apparent stasis, although we now know there's not a real stasis there. But that's where that would have come from. And the idea of the created universe, that's birth. That's part of our human experience as well. And when we talk about the end, that's kind of, that's like our death. So the question is okay, so most models of cosmology you could put into one of those categories. And you can ask the question, well, is that all the possible theories there are? Or is that just us humans trying to impose our, are we just so influenced by our humanity that that's the only kinds of theories we can come up with? And one of the interesting things about recent theories is that many of them don't quite so simply categorize. And so that's interesting. I don't know, we don't know whether or not they're true or not, but I think that's an interesting development that we're breaking out of those traditional molds. I don't know, in some sense, evolution is also undergoing a change in terms of being more complex, not being a simple story,
right.
but being, you were even simplifying it the way you were describing it, but some sort of combination of, slow evolution and catastrophic evolution, and just things are more complex than any simple narrative
Right, it's a
will
combination
tell
of
us.
the two. Lots of times it's slow evolution taking place, and then you have these apocalyptic, catastrophes taking
Right. So one of the things that science forces us to do is to come to grips with whether our narratives make sense. So you keep pushing your narrative and saying, okay, if this narrative is true, then I would guess the following would be true. And then you look to see if that's true. And when it's not, you're forced to correct your narrative. And that's the discovery of the scientific method. That was the grand discovery, that you take the scientific method and you add the human brain to it, and really something miraculous happens. Suddenly new information is created at a much greater rate than we were able to create any other time, any other period up till the present. Exactly why that works that way, I don't know. I think it really requires both the humanity and the scientific method to work. The humanity to be imaginative, to come up with stories, to come up with guesses, huge jumps, huge leaps, and then the scientific method to check that, to put that in check and say, okay, that's a good guess and that's a bad guess. And somehow that works together in some magical way that has led to a tremendous run of progress over the last several hundred years.
The scientific method, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. The scientific method is something that exists outside of us, that we kind of
Yes,
came up
we
like
discovered.
like the monolith and...
Oh, it was discovered, yeah. The idea that you empirically test your ideas, that you don't just tell your story, and because it's a good story. That's what this. We were talking about theology. Theologies are really good stories, which have a lot of appeal to them, and there's some good lessons to be learned from them. But then you want to, is that story true or is that story true? Well, theology, we maybe not answer the question, but for, why stars form, there are different stories you could think of.
Right.
But you need so the human imagination allows you to leap and think of many possible stories, and then you impose on that the scientific method with many different, I have to find objective ways of demonstrating to you that idea is right and that idea is wrong. Objective in the sense that, people in different parts of the world with different backgrounds can all agree on, all make those observations and come to the same conclusions. That was an invented idea, and invented in the Renaissance. It was not an idea that was there historically beforehand, and it led to a tremendous run of several hundred years up to the present time, of the rate of which new information has come to us is just exponentially increased since that time. Maybe there's a better invention, something better than the scientific method for increasing the rate at which we gain information. We haven't discovered it yet. I don't know. But at the moment, this is our best invention.
That does just sound to me, as a literary critic, as a kind of utopian narrative. You said before, this is the death of utopian narratives. The scientific method is the miraculous.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know enough history of science to talk about it, but obviously, all pre-modern societies, had some form of trial and error. You made stone, implements. You figured out ways to do it. It wasn't a formalized scientific method, but it was it was a form of empiricism, I think. But something happened in the 16th, 17th century, some convergence, I would think, of political, economic, social thinking, such that this idea of standardization, of repeatability, of verifiability, there were different goals. I guess I would question the sense that, oh, well, just for no particular reason, somebody thought of this great way of doing inquiry. The results of it, I think, are as you said, but the origins of it, maybe that was discussed 2 weeks ago, but the origins of it, I would think there would be more other social, ideological, economic questions that were at play. One wanted to be able to do things. One wanted to be able to explore the world. One wanted to be able to create products. There were markets developing. So at least that's just the mindset that I
don't disagree. I don't disagree that that was part of the spirit of the time. So being successful, it meant being able to succeed in a marketplace was different than being successful because, let's say, I was the king or something like that. So it led to more competition of products and a competition of ideas, and knowledge is power. And so suddenly it was possible to be powerful without being, let's say, aristocratic by having knowledge. And I think that's, I'm not a historian, but my guess would be that would be part of the forces that are at work that led to what I think is clearly an invention, because certainly the way knowledge was gathered, say, before Galileo and Newton is quite different than the way it was gathered since Galileo and Newton, and the amount of progress that's been made there in every area of science is just, there's no comparison to what was there before.
I'm just fascinated by the connection between senses of endings and ways of knowing. Mm-hmm. We know how to know now differently. We know factually. We know in an empirical way. Things are objectifiable.
Well, so for example, there are different ideas. This is a question. But maybe the way to respond to that is to say, to make it a scientifically meaningful issue, it had better have some empirical consequences. So in some sense, being a scientist, you restrict yourself to a domain of questions, or domain of issues, which have empirical consequences. If they not, you're welcome to think about them, but they're outside the domain of science.
I'm wondering about cosmologies that allow for different ways of knowing. I'm also wondering...
Different empirical consequences, you mean?
How different cosmologies allow different ways of knowing. I'm really thinking of the 17th century with Milton and the culture that he represents being in competition with this Baconian, Hobbesian universe, which is, Hobbes really comes armed with Bacon and anticipating the royal society. And he comes to destroy Donne, Shakespeare, and Milton. These are not legitimate ways of knowing. They argue through paradox. They argue through what Hobbes will call and reject as metaphor and contradiction. It's also an extremely resonant question here. How does this kind of empirical knowledge, Jim talked before about primary process, about dreams, what happens to those primary process insights, those insights that are not reducible to secondary process? How does the psychoanalyst intertwine with this miraculous narrative of the, and I'm not doubting the miraculous narrative. I have my BlackBerry at home also. It's miraculous. I'm not undermining that miraculous narrative, but I'm also trying to understand the consequences of that cosmology, grounded as it is in objectifiable reality, with other cosmologies which allow for other kinds of knowing. And that's a literary and historical interest of mine, because I'm always interested in the relationship between Hobbes and Milton. When my mind are in the beginnings, Milton in the one is the beginning of a kind of modernity, but he's also the end. And Hobbes, of course, is just announcing, as I said before, just the death of this other kind of culture, and the death of a kind of knowing which is based upon metaphor, which is based upon paradox. And it seems so much of what would go on in this building would have to do with that other kind of knowing.
So maybe it's worth saying that in cosmology, So although cosmology is in some sense one of the oldest sciences in terms of people thinking about it, in terms of being an empirical science, it's one of the newest. So up until 1920, we weren't even able to see and recognize there were galaxies beyond our own. And we've gathered more data in the last 10 years about the nearby, intermediate, and most distant observable parts of the universe, which correspond to the present, intermediate, and distant past of the universe that we just didn't have before. So from a scientific point of view, you can just take the data from the last 10 years and throw against that all the concepts of cosmology that have been developed by humans throughout human history, and almost all of them are inconsistent with those observations, with the exception of two I can name, two ideas, which is a pretty amazing statement just based on a decade's worth of data. So where does science come into it? Well, if you insist on the scientific methodology that your cosmology should make sense with an objective observation, which is what scientists do, then you can sort through these different ideas and say, okay, that was a great idea, a very imaginative idea, but that idea is not our universe, and okay, and this one is, even though it may not have been the one you would have chosen. So that's all I can offer.
It's a lot.
I think so, but but you may not always be happy with the outcome.
So maybe if there aren't further comments from the roundtable, we could open it up to questions from the audience. Please, state your name and.
It's Kinsel. I'm a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist. Just got a couple of things. I think a lady who the sessions were weekly there on Monday, and she said that the world was going to end on Friday. And then the next session, when she came out on Monday, I asked her how she felt about the situation. She said, "No, it's going to end on Friday." This went on for months. The reason I mention it is that I think the apocalyptic and sort of dramatic sense of ending may have a basis in a stereotypical unconscious part of our minds, where it's sort of boilerplate, it's stereotypical, it doesn't seem to be based on anything, it's delusional, and that it just is sort of there. Had my therapy focused on relieving her of the problem that the world was going to end, that it would have gotten nowhere, and probably actually would have gotten worse. An antipsychotic medication actually did reduce that over a period of time, and she got to the point where she said, "I just don't think about it anymore." The other issue was that the problem with anxiety with this lady was her marital problems, and I thought, oh, it's symbolic. See, if the world's going to end, what that means to her is my marriage is going to break up, and that will be the end of the world for me. There really wasn't any connection at all. In fact, the marriage wasn't breaking up. In fact, we did make some progress with the marital therapy, and she did fairly well. So it's just sort of a word of caution, I guess, is that in the unconscious, the stereotypical unconscious we have. I worked in a prison for a while. I asked inmates to write down, to draw me the devil. There was an amazing similarity. I had 12 drawings of people that didn't know each other and were not comparing notes. A rodent-like figure, big teeth, big eyes, big ears, the tail, a pitchfork, so on. This is a stereotypical unconscious, and I'm afraid it fuels things like apocalypse and so on, that it keeps that going. That we just keep in mind that it may be part of our whole structure of our mind that is more stereotypical than actually symbolic or actually meaningful in any kind of way. The other thing I want to ask is, for you in particular, is would you consider that there might be an eternal universe, but there also might be a local Big Bang universe that we live in that's not eternal? That is there, do we perhaps perceive that intuitively. And is there something having to do with envy? Are we, because we're so finite, envious of the eternal that may be out there? And so we try to go through elaborate situations and narratives and stories and so on to make believe that that our life is eternal. You know, it's not the universe. In other words, are we envious of the cosmos?
Thank you.
I can't address. It's an interesting question, the last one. I can't answer it, but to answer your scientific question, which is, is it possible to have a universe which is eternal on average? There are parts that are always existing and new creations taking place, and parts which are ending in one way or another, ending by catastrophically or ending by this sort of petering out. Yes, that is the picture. That is, if you were going to guess, if you were going to describe the prevalent picture among cosmologists, that would be the prevalent picture among cosmologists at present. The physics, the science seems to allow for that possibility, and it seems, by it allows for it, I mean it makes predictions about the part of the universe that we observe that so far have been verified. So it doesn't allow us to see out there to check it, but there are other inferences of such theories that do make implications for what we should observe about the radiation from the early universe and the distribution of galaxies that so far work. And so right now that idea seems to be working well.
I would just add, maybe, that ancient cosmologists, from the Talmudic rabbis to Augustine, assume that time is a created thing, and that there is something beyond time and eternity. But I also would just add that speculations about eternity dovetail with what I keep on coming back to, this speculation about the divine. I mean, the non-empirically objectifiable. I think that was the question in a sense. Is there something beyond the empirically objectifiable? And that becomes not a question, I think, only for scientists, although I hear the scientific answer. That becomes a conversation where philosophers and maybe theologians also can answer.
Ernestine Bradley, The New School. I have the impression that we were really talking about two different times. One, the cultural time, in which theology is subsumed, all theology, not just Judaic or Christian or whatnot, in which literature is subsumed, from Doris Lessing to Milton and whatnot, psychiatry. And what I was lacking in this conversation was the fact of a self-awareness that we are all talking in a box, that we are Western-oriented. We have not included other boxes, which would still be boxes. So that's really, I don't want us to believe that we are, the horse's mouth, and that's why it was very important for me to mention this. But if I use the term myth, that every culture needs a myth to deal with death, not just with ending, but with death. And sometimes that death can lead into rebirth, so there is no ending. And I thought, maybe we should also keep that in mind. And then the last one, the one question I really have is a question addressed to the cosmologists and the astrophysicists, whether astrophysics isn't, again, a myth, a contemporary myth, that is totally dependent on the instruments that are available. The instruments, chasing the Big Bang or whatever. And of course you can say that the instruments themselves are already the outcome of the direction in which you want to go with your research. But I wonder, again, whether this is not inside a box, which is our box today.
Well, let's see. So that was a number of interesting comments, and I'm trying to decide which one to begin with. I do think that I tried to make the point that I think science is it's a human-invented method, which combines our ability to imagine and make myths and make stories and make narratives with objectivity in the sense of the instruments and ways in which we can make prescriptions that, I can write something down and say, you do this observation and you will observe, I predict you will observe the following, and you will go do it and you will actually observe it, which is an interesting truth, which turns out to have a lot of practical value that we can do that. As opposed to other stories which may be less practical, may be very appealing, but may be less practical. But I mean, you can call, I'm not sure the words have connotations. So when you say, is science a kind of mythology which involves instruments and mathematics and you can use the word myth, but I think it somehow deserves a different word, and so I'll use the word science.
Well, I think you're saying that there's a difference between calling science a mythology and science arising from the same human capacities that myth-making entail. It doesn't mean that science is
I think we've extended our imagination. I think and that's sort of the point I was trying to make. I think a scientific methodology extends us beyond our imagination to be able to distinguish different stories which are of practical interest. Like, I want to know if there's going to be a solar eclipse in Japan today, okay? Which there is. Okay. The fact that I can predict that is based on observations, and then you can go off and check with the Japanese, call your friends in Japan and say, yeah, sure enough, there was a solar eclipse there, is different than other myths I could make up of why there are solar eclipses, which would not give me that power to predict. So I think of science as just it's a way we've learned to make our imaginations more powerful, to be able to predict and explain things in ways that now allow us to say what's going to happen next, give us better control over our lives, our health, all the things that technology brings us. Those are real things that science has brought us, which make it different than myth-making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the mythological or ideological consequences are that the idea of predictability becomes a kind of fetish. Mm-hmm. So that if a discipline does not lead toward predictive consequences, then it's devalued. And I think that is maybe what Ernestine was talking about, and that's certainly something that occurs to me. For example, the very prominent pseudoscience of economics. You're allowed to laugh. It seems to me, its predictive assertions seem to me completely
inadequate,
at least. And yet there's an ideological fixation on this discipline such that the smartest guys in the room are the economists, because they can do these amazing things with numbers, and they have this whole apparatus. And so the scientific instrument has now been appropriated by a field which really has nothing to do, I'd say, with science as you describe it. So there is a mythology of science. Actual scientists, I don't think, are part of it in the whole, but there is a myth that comes from it.
Well, it's an attempt to, okay, we've discovered this method that works for certain kinds of questions. It works really well for explaining why this table is as solid as it is, and the same methodology doesn't work so well for economics. And so science is limited. It's as I said, it's an invention, and like any invention, like the BlackBerry, it works well for some things, but not for other things. And how do we? But you try, and when it works really powerfully, right? And we know we've seen that, and so okay. So it's natural to say, well, could we apply it to answer this question or that other question? And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't, and so you try. It's part of human efforts to try to gain knowledge.
I have a more narrow technical question for Michael Sachs. A more narrow technical question for Dr. Steinhardt. Is it thought that the amount of dark energy is increasing, and if so, how does it come about?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
it's a simple question.
It's a simple question. So, Yes, it is increasing in terms of its total amount of dark energy, but there's two things going on at the same time. The universe is expanding, and as it expands, energy spreads out, becomes more dilute, but different forms of energy become dilute at different rates. Matter, just spreads out. The more you make, if you double the volume, its density decreases by a factor of 2. Radiation decreases at a faster rate because as it spreads out, the photons redshift, so they actually lose energy faster. Dark energy is the energy that loses its energy either not at all, its density not at all, or at the slowest. So over time, it eventually takes over because everything else dilutes and it doesn't. Another thing that's happening is when you're stretching the universe, you're creating more space, and that space has energy in it. So there's therefore more energy, total of energy is growing. And where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from gravity. So one thing that's not, we should have all learned in elementary school, but I even find my advanced graduate students don't quite appreciate it, is that gravity is the one force from which you can draw an infinite amount of energy. And this is an example of it. An expanding universe filled with dark energy keeps stretching, creating new space filled with dark energy. So the total dark energy grows, the gravitational energy decreases, but gravitational energy is a kind of bottomless pit. So you can just keep doing that forever, and that's what the laws of physics tell us can happen and could be happening. That could be happening that's one possibility for the long-term future of the universe. That's all that happens. There's more and more dark energy, less and less of everything else.
Go ahead. This gentleman, then you.
My name is Irving Heller, and I'm just passing through like the rest of us in line. That's apropos of my question. This has been I really mean a great postdoctoral discussion. But I would like you to focus for a couple of minutes on the starkest notion of one's end. That's one's personal death, one's demise. I would venture to say that to discuss the topic today, if this were your final hour, would you see things differently? Would it be clarifying, terrifying, or indifferent? Silence is more than it's been alluded to by these.
Yeah, I think Bill would have been fine with it.
Would it be my last hour?
Yeah.
Well, in my last hour, I want preservation of poetry, and I'm wondering if that gets preserved with these cosmologies. You said, I might not like it, but one of the things I don't like is there, Jim, you're the post-apocalyptic. Is there post-apocalyptic poetry? I mean, you mentioned Lessing. I mean, Blake, we know that Blake...
Literary theory is post-apocalyptic poetry.
We know that Blake worried about Newton, because Newton made poetry impossible. Or he thought so.
To get away from the intellectual level, what about the emotional level of life? That was alluded to by Dr. Serio. Where is that in all our efforts to try to get to the point of it all?
I don't know. Is one's sense of the meaning of life dependent on the actual act of dying, the moment of one's death? I don't know. I mean, I think there's meaning in every moment of your life. I think it's melodramatic to put it in those terms. Of course, when one gets to that point, then you'll get to that point.
Somebody suggested to me we should have an undertaker for this round table.
So I don't know. I guess I can't answer it.
I'm not sure that to answer it depends what questions you want to answer, but you're asking whether the emotions you have near your moments before death are helpful. Is that what you're asking? Are they helpful in addressing these questions? My guess is they're not helpful in answering these questions because you're emotional. You're a little preoccupied with something else. Yeah.
On the omega point, I was born.
Yeah, probably irrationally, but I don't know.
Go ahead.
I'm very interested that you try to connect the arts and literature with the sciences in terms of what's developing in the science and wanting to feel that the arts have to follow suit, because most often the arts have dealt with certain structural elements, and there's an implication that some of these structural elements you felt were obsolete, for instance like tension or drama or apocalypse or contradiction or paradox. And it's curious that you're thinking, as science develops, we, the artists and the writers and the philosophers, have to change our structure of the very nature of our existence, because we experience life in one way, and even if our knowledge changes, there's still certain elements in the paradox of living because of the inherent tensions in it. So I found this, why were you so concerned that, my goodness, actually that seems to be some of the problems that what's happening in the arts today, that they're dissolving and evaporating and receding, almost in fear that certain structures are obsolete. And this is just a general comment. And I have one other thing that always interested me, maybe because in philosophy it was mentioned in Schopenhauer, and so about repetition, and Heraclitus speaking about you can never step in the same river twice. And it seems to me as you're talking that repetition, there is not any longer a concept of repetition in science, but there is some base by which you work that gradually evolves. But is there a underlying structure that keeps changing, or is there, or do you find there are some elements that are building stones that are there? If you follow what I'm saying. I mean, the Heraclitean view versus the idea, is there such a thing as a repetition? Do we ever repeat anything? No.
I think the first question, I mean, the humanities have been anxious, poets have been anxious since Plato. We've become anxious again in the 17th century with Hobbes, and we became more anxious with the development of science. The disciplinary hierarchies have changed. I mean, go to my university in Israel, Bar Ilan, and see the size of the new physics buildings and the nanotechnology buildings and the old humanities buildings. It's very clear why that anxiety should exist. I'm also just struck by the assertion of the separation between the emotional and the intellectual, is that that's somehow a given. And again, I think, where are we? In this building, in which I think that dichotomy would be very strongly interrogated. And to think about the role that the poetic functions, not only, as Hobbes would derogatorily put it, for something which is nice looking or pretty, but the way primary process functions as a way of knowing, and paradox functions as a way not only of some kind of ephemeral poetic expression, but in which the emotions and the intellect are somehow more unified. I mean, that's, I think, one of the inheritances of the scientific worldview, is that the emotions have been pushed out. Poetry has been pushed to the side.
Yeah. I don't think the arts really are necessarily sort of following the sciences or trying to sort of keep up with what scientific developments are doing. Except, I don't know, the science that seems to have captured people's imaginations most recently seems to be neuroscience, and the resonance of arts and neuroscience is something that people seem to be thinking about quite a bit. The gap in sort of disciplinary emphases between, cosmology and, these kind of enormous wastes of time. These voids of time are. The question is sort of, where do we come together in our thinking? We're thinking about different things. I mean, the histories of our disciplines are different, and we.
Maybe, this is sort of like a Zoroastrian thing. Maybe there should be an inherent tension. What's wrong with things that aren't resolved there, but are tension between what's happening scientifically, what's going on in the arts? There can remain a tension between the two, which creates an apocalyptic vision, or creates a dramatic vision of things.
Yeah, I don't think there's any problem with different fields having different methodologies and different approaches. There's different kinds of people. We had different childhoods. We had different teachers when we were in high school. We went different ways. So that's what we did. The question is, where do we come together socially and politically, or are there questions which we really do think about in common as A, mortal beings, and B, as citizens. And I think I would hope that that's the more important question, I think, than whether our particular academic interests coincide.
Well, science is not a robotic process. It's a creative process, like in the arts and so where does the inspiration come from? Well, the inspiration comes from a very similar human process. Sometimes you might go to an art museum and look at a piece of art, and that might inspire you to think of an idea that turns out to have a scientific meaning. So
that's the purpose of these roundtables.
Or this, something. And that's why I'm here. Part of the reason why we're here, coming to this, is because this kind of thing can inspire unusual discussions that gets you just thinking a little bit differently, and then suddenly on the train home, I may think about a problem that and view it in a different way, and something good happens from it. So that's where the human part of the process comes from. I want to answer your question about repeatability. In fact, there's a sort of double problem about repeatability. Number one, if you mean by exact repeatability, classically, before we consider quantum physics, that is statistically, so unlikely as not to be worth considering. But with quantum mechanics, it even becomes ill-defined, because when you say exact repeatability, it assumes that you have an exact notion of position, time, energy, mass. And in quantum physics, those are all now fuzzy objects which only have probabilities, not certainties. So that's the current condition of our current way of understanding the best we can do in the universe. So we can say it's approximately repeating, something is approximately repeating in certain average quantities, but exactly repeating would almost lose meaning in the quantum sense.
Go ahead.
My name is Ken Wade. I'm an artist from downtown, and I want to talk more about dark matter.
Dark matter.
Sounds like a very sinister thing. I'm remembering movies when I was a little kid. Lon Chaney Jr. used to morph into the Wolfman when the moon came out full, so I know we're affected by stuff out there. So I'm wondering, this is an increasing phenomenon, as you said.
Dark energy, yeah, right.
So does this explain everything, or does it have any influence on matters here, like all these terrible storms, the recent Republican primary thing? People are acting a little bit weird. I'm just wondering is there a push-pull thing on this?
Okay. So first of all, the term dark energy or is not meant to be sinister. It's meant to tell you that it has energy and that it doesn't emit or absorb light. So it's a fairly boring term and not my favorite term for it, but that's become the convention. So although there's lots of it, it's extremely thinly spread. So within our solar system, most of the matter in our solar system is not dark. Most of the energy, in our solar system is not dark energy. It's the matter you know and love, the energy that makes up you, the Earth, the Sun, the planets, and the like. However, space is enormous. It's hard to conceive of until you've thought about the numbers, and even with the numbers, it may not help you. But space is enormous compared to the places where matter is concentrated. And if you imagine that even in those places between galaxies, there's still this thin distribution of dark energy, it adds up to be a huge total. So the total is huge. But within our galaxy, within our solar system, it's so thinly spread that it doesn't have any significant effect. So in fact, its only effect is when you look at the universe in the large. And then when it sums up to be more than all the matter in galaxies and stars, then it becomes the dominant influence in controlling the stretching of the universe. And because it's gravitationally repulsive, it encourages the stretching and causes this acceleration. Whereas the matter is trying to hold itself together, it wins because there's more of it, because it's so thinly spread, but it's spread out, but occupies so much space. Yes. won't affect the elections.
So my name is Peter Dickey. I'm a psychoanalyst, and I was originally a nurse, and I worked a lot with the end of life. people at the end of life. And one of the things that I think you mentioned struck me about this gathering and what we're doing here. And it seems to me that it's a lot of what we're doing is intellectualizing, speaking in the abstract and being scientific is a defense against the anxieties that we all could feel if we took the time about perhaps our own impending death, whether it is or isn't. My religion, if you like, and it's not really a religion, it's a lifestyle, is Buddhism. And Buddhists have a way of making impermanence meaningful to us by using it to motivate us, maybe, and say, life, I'm mortal, my life is infinite, and I must do something meaningful, is one of the common prayers, if you like, of a Buddhist. And that, therefore, is motivating. Impermanence is seen all around. You might walk down the street and see a pigeon that's dropped dead overnight. Any one of us could drop dead now or on the way home. And it's having that awareness in our consciousness that lends to or adds to the quality, perhaps, of our lives, because we know that is there. To ignore it is a defense against feeling that.
Thank you. You want to wrap it up?
Yeah, so I want to thank the audience comments and interlocutors and our panelists today, Jim Berger, Paul Steinhardt, Bill Koblener, and Michael Rampino for a stimulating discussion. Perhaps I can invoke Winston Churchill's words from 1942 when he said, this is not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps it's the end of the beginning. And please follow us on helixcenter.org for further announcements for our fall programs, and thank you all for coming. It wasn't that